Yeah, so really excited for the chance to visit with you guys today. As Heather mentioned, all questions are good, all conversation is good, except for the Jack's drubbing of the bison. If we can save that till after my remarks and after we stop recording. But I'm ready to take whatever criticism or good-natured ripping or non-good-natured ripping that you'd like then. So my name is Dave Ripplinger. I'm an extension specialist up at NDSU Extension. I've had the privilege to work with Heather, Matt Dearson, and a few other folks at SDSU over the years, and this is just another opportunity for us to reach out. So my area of activity is kind of unique. So my official title is Bioenergy Bioproducts Specialist. My position itself was actually created by the state of North Dakota about 15 years ago to work with farmers and industry on commercializing biofuels primarily and other related products. And what it's done is really been a chance for NDSU and people in my position, now me, to engage on those topics, as well as kind of very much remain up to speed on carbon and greenhouse gases, because that drives a lot of what's going on in the biofuels market. And now more recently, with carbon offset contracts and other activity with carbon and greenhouse gases in agriculture has been pretty popular, keeping me quite busy. Much of this talk is based on some work that I've developed in partnership with Iowa State and University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And we actually have a funded project by North Central Extension Risk Management called Carbon Offset Producer Education, or COPE. But I'm going to cover a lot of different things to provide what I hope is a solid background for all of you in terms of what's going on in carbon contracts. And when I say carbon contracts, carbon offset contracts, which I'll describe in just a little bit. The main thing I want everyone to take away from this is very real. There are farmers today under contract. They've changed their practices, and to compensate them for that, they are receiving payments of US dollars. And oftentimes that financial payment is significant and something not to be ignored. We have seen a lot of different activity in this space. Right now, it seems as if this younger market or this younger opportunity is starting to mature. But this is very much a real conversation. In fact, I don't have the slide in my deck, but we do know about 10% of farmers in the Midwest have had conversations with carbon contract folks. And even though it's a relatively small number, 1% of farmers who've had those, 1% of farmers in total, about 10% of those who've had the conversation actually are in carbon contracts. That's a really small percent, right? But not when you sit back and you realize there's tens of thousands of commercial producers in the Midwest. And once you start thinking about it that way, we're into the hundreds, if not thousands of producers, and we're definitely into the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres. And again, in many respects, we're just getting started. One of the questions I often get is, why would anyone pay for this? Who's paying for this? And what we have is a relatively small but important group of corporations who want to address climate and greenhouse gas emissions for their business. They take it very much to heart what their footprint looks like, and they're working to address it. Some of those that are most active are the Apples and the Microsofts of the world, the Googles and such. And really, it's important to know too, is we're in many respects, we're just getting started with this. And those are the companies who are very much interested, very much engaged in this, but they're also helping just build this system with the expectation that in the next few years, in the coming decades, this carbon offset market will become very, very large. And by very, very large, expectations of up to $50 billion in annual carbon offset transactions. So going back to these companies that are looking at this, why are they doing it? And sometimes you can, and it's sometimes framed as if they're doing this because they're altruistic, trying to help folks out, but really that's not the case. They have some very practical reasons why they're doing this. There are concerns about being able to secure financing. I'm in North Dakota, have a lot of interaction with the oil and gas industry. The ability for oil and gas companies to get financing with the baggage associated with fossil fuels is really, really tough. It is a real concern many businesses have. And even other businesses, food and agriculture businesses, all businesses, large multinational corporations, they all have to take heed of this. There was a statement by the CEO of BlackRock, which is the largest financial institution in the world, who basically says, you've got to look at this. You've got to make this part of your thinking. The next one is the government's likely soon going to require it. So the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, oversees all publicly traded companies. And about a year ago, they told everyone, press release to the world, that companies should be ready to report greenhouse gas emissions, that this is going to be part of what they do. They want to know about how these businesses interact with the environment and the people impacted by their business. And of course, to me, those are two very practical things. You know, I need money to run my business. I need to be in good graces with the federal government to be successful. There's also the possibility of doing this to market to customers. There are some customers who really do value that label, that small carbon footprint green label, just like organic and other products. The idea is that it's a relatively small part of the market, but influential and growing in size. Also on the practical side is just mitigating risk. So many companies do have exposure to what I'm going to call climate risk. And it kind of comes in two ways. The first is their business might actually be potentially impacted by changes in climate, just like if climate varied significantly in the upper Midwest and the Dakotas, you know, that can impact your business. And of course, we're used to pretty big, pretty extreme weather events, you know, long-term situations, drought, and up here flooding. And those are very much real. So they're concerned about that. And they're also concerned about just the fact that when these regulators come, are they ready? And both of those are real and important. Then finally, there is this issue of ESG, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So ESG gets a lot of traction in the news. It's in environmental, social, and corporate governance. And it's kind of this catch-all for the idea that businesses have to think about more than just making money. And that's really not a fair way to look at it. The idea is really that there are many ways that a corporation's value, that is their stock price, can be impacted based on things other than just explicitly trying to drive the bottom line. And you know, there's many you know cases of this. You know, having that good public image, having products that appeal to folks. You know, there's tremendous value in that marketing that can't be ignored. But there's been kind of a resurgence in this thought and additional attention into the ways in which these businesses interact with people, the environment, and how they manage themselves. The market right now, there's actually many different carbon markets, and many of those do impact agriculture, including in South Dakota. What we're going to talk about today, these carbon offset markets, are voluntary carbon markets, because you can think about it as these companies are doing it because they want to. No one is forcing them yet, at least. There's also an entirely different set of markets called regulatory markets. And that's where the federal government or a state may require certain things to happen, and that carbon markets might be created because of that. The best example is California has created a market that incentivizes low carbon fuels, which has been a major source of revenue for corn ethanol refineries, biofuels producers, but it all comes because the state of California created those rules. There's a carbon market, carbon is traded, but not because companies want to do it, but because the state of California wants it. So kind of continuing on in providing a maybe too large foundation to get into the specifics and the most important things to farmers in South Dakota, I think it's helpful to understand how corporate greenhouse gas emissions accounting works. This is the standard framework, and basically the idea is a business is responsible for certain emissions. They're responsible for those that come from their facility. They're responsible for those that might come from energy they purchase. And really, really important, especially if we think about agriculture, they have responsibility for emissions across their supply chain. And so this would be suppliers and customers. They have some ownership in those emissions. And I'll give an example of that in just a minute. As corporations look to reduce their emissions, they can do it in one of those three ways: their own business, the energy they buy, or the supply chain. Or they can also look at other parts of the economy, pay certain folks to change their behavior to offset their emissions. And so that's where this carbon offset term comes from. It's they're interacting with businesses that aren't in their supply chain, that don't supply them energy. Case in point, Microsoft, even though you may run Windows at home, you really don't have a strong personal business relationship with Microsoft. But you could almost certainly change your practices, your crop production practices, generate carbon credits, which would then be used to offset what Microsoft is doing. And again, it's somewhere else in the economy. So to kind of bring this home, I really like this because we all know Tyson, either as consumers or from the livestock industry, and obviously being in South Dakota, even stronger ties to that as you get close to some of their facilities. Tyson has publicly stated that they want to reduce their emissions by 2030, 30% by 2030. One of the things I always, when I hear 30% by 2030, it's a little gimmicky. There's a little bit of marketing to it, but it's almost something they have to do. But they've stated in plain terms, they know that they need to address greenhouse gas emissions to ensure that they can get financing. And it takes billions of dollars to run a business like Tyson. They're also seeing many of their customers demanding that greenhouse gas emissions, other issues be addressed. And they've gone so far to state how they want to do this. The first thing they want to do is just buy renewable energy. That's really easy to do. That's signing a contract, purchase power agreement with a wind farm or a solar farm, hydroelectric if we had extra. And that's easy to do, and it can offset those emissions or reduce those emissions because you're no longer taking it off the grid. But what's also really interesting, and I think for the South Dakota cattle producers, they're very much looking at working with their suppliers to reduce the carbon footprints of the animals they process. So if we think about Tyson, they go, back up that chain: feedlot, feeder, cow-calf, corn, all of those inputs. They're interested in those things, and they're going to engage with their suppliers to help create this system where they can reduce their emissions. Now, exactly how this is rolled out, how successful they are, the mechanics of their system, we'll see what happens. But Tyson is a major player. And as we know, obviously market concentration issues, but they, even by themselves, could put a lot of pressure on suppliers. And in tandem with other folks doing this, it'd be really difficult not to do. Again, we don't know if they're just going to say you must start doing things this way, or we'll pay you more, or we'll prefer to buy from ranchers or from suppliers of corn for having smaller footprints or doing something to decrease those greenhouse gas emissions. Coming back to offsets, so we have these carbon contracts that are being purchased by folks like Microsoft and Apple, and what they're doing is buying what's really a tradable instrument, and it basically represents a metric ton of carbon dioxide emission reductions. So they're paying for that metric ton so many dollars, and that's different than what a farmer would see. A farmer will see, I will be paid so much for going no-till. But in that bigger wholesale market, they're buying and trading these carbon credits. A couple of reasons why obviously agriculture has gotten a lot of attention in this space, or at least in agriculture, this has risen dramatically in size of importance to the industry. Just in the last couple of years, I'd actually start at the bottom point first. It's been long recognized that agriculture has the ability to capture and store carbon in the soil. So soil organic content is really a big deal. And that's what a lot of folks go to, because they look and see, gosh, we could incentivize farmers to change their practices to increase carbon capture in the soil as an offset to emissions that we might be releasing. So that's been by far at the top of the list of interest. Also important is agriculture releases a lot of emissions. And one of the things I always want to bring up is we don't have to feel bad about this. We have emissions because we do a lot of work and we interact with much of the world, right? Our footprint in terms of the square miles that we work as cropland or have as pasture is gigantic. And with that, there are emissions. We are feeding the world. We are helping fuel the world. And there are costs to doing that. And I don't think there's any problem with understanding, recognizing that. At the same time, if we can find ways to be more efficient, to reduce our fertilizer use especially, or how we manage our livestock or other issues, and it makes sense for an individual producer, well, let them decide, let them do it. But those current emissions are really just kind of what is. Getting a little bit further into these contracts. So I don't know if any of you have had these conversations or signed a contract yourself. My back of the envelope survey, I've given a talk similar to this a few dozen times on the low end in North Dakota and parts of Minnesota in the last 18 months. And I always ask them, how many of you have had these conversations? How many of you have signed? And the number who signed of the thousands of folks I've talked to is 3. That being said, there's clearly interest in this. There is activity, but there's a lot of growth that's going to have to occur and things to be figured out. But anyways, right now what we see is about a dozen different companies with varying levels of engagement with U.S. farmers. Not so much ranchers yet, but we're getting closer to that. That's certainly going to come about, in the coming months. There's some activity. I don't know if there's much up here on the livestock side. But anyways, for each one of these companies, as they're visiting with farmers, they each have their own contract with their own terms, and they change quite regularly. Not just the price, sometimes the actual terms of the contract. What we're experiencing is these companies trying to find offers that are most appealing. They want to have action. They want to have farmers sign. They also need to make it work for their business, but they are regularly revisiting what they're looking for from farmers. But the basic idea of all of these contracts is a farmer or rancher will adopt a new practice, and then in exchange for adopting that practice, that farmer or rancher will receive a payment, a financial payment. And various structures, again, different practices as well as duration. It could be a 1-year contract with a single payment. There are a few who will pay back a few years if you recently adopted a new practice. But that's the general concept of these contracts and the key term. But there's some other things that are really important that often come up in discussion. As I noted before, and it's really important to note that the practices for carbon offset contracts have to be new. The Microsofts of the world, when buying an offset, need for something to change. If nothing's changed, there's no value in it to them. So this concept of additionality is really important. At the same time, it's kind of upsetting. So in North Dakota, just like many parts of South Dakota, we have a lot of no-till. We've had folks who have been no-till for decades. And in general, those producers are not able to sign carbon offset contracts because it's not a new practice. And that causes a lot of frustration. At the same time, as I mentioned at the start, carbon offset contracts are only one part of this. they're an important part, get a lot of attention, just one part of this. Another thing that varies quite a bit is the length of the contract. It can vary from, a single year to multiple years. And in some cases, not only is it multiple years into the future, typically with a payment in each year that practice continues, but then there's also a longer period of time where the benefits from those practices can't be undone. So for example, if I adjusted my tillage and I'm, expected to be capturing carbon in the soil, I do that for 10 years. And then in year 15, because of whatever reason, I decide to go back to conventional tillage, that may cause a problem. So though that length, there's both that period of activity and then that period of not undoing what had been done. Next thing that's required, and so this is really something that comes from the folks who are already in agriculture, who have systems. Oftentimes they'll say, well, we want you to sign this contract. We are happy to pay you for these practices, but we ask that you use our technology to track. And the technology is really not specific to carbon offsets, but really part of a bigger bundle of solutions that they want to provide. One of the next things, which is good news, is that in general, these contracts allow stacking. And stacking is the idea that you could go to NRCS or to someone else and receive a payment for the practice and be able to sign a carbon offset contract. Participating in another program that incentivizes that practice doesn't necessarily exclude you from signing that contract. It's important to know you can't sell the same carbon twice, but if you're simply receiving a government payment via existing NRCS programs, that's completely fine. The other thing we see, which is a negative issue generally for those longer contracts, especially those with that additional horizon, there are clawback provisions. So this question I get regularly, well, what happens if you go back and go back to conventional tillage? What happens? Well, for some contracts, those that have that longer horizon, they do have a clawback provision that says, we want you will pay us back. If we go out there and what we expected to happen is not what happened, what you promised to do, you didn't do, they reserve that right to claw back the funds. And that's a bit of an issue. In general, we have long-term no-till farmers, in our states. The idea that they're going to willy-nilly decide to change that part of their farm, it takes a lot. It really doesn't happen, but there has to be this term in the contract to address that. So I've already made a couple of comments about what practices are eligible. Really what we're looking at are two things primarily to date, using cover crops and then also alternative tillage. So minimum till, strip till, no till, those do a couple of things. One, you might be using less energy, have less emissions from your equipment as you do it, but really it's capturing that organic material in the soil. And we have some pretty good science that backs that up. First, we know that it does happen. Exactly to what extent is a little bit uncertain for many cases, but that's really what they're looking at, again, because that appeals to a Microsoft because it very much offsets other emissions they might have. Beyond that, what we're starting to see is additional activity in livestock operations. How you might manage your manure, how you manage your grazing can impact the flow of organic material. And the idea behind both of those is that if we can adjust our practices so we can ensure that we can get more material into the soil permanently, that could be incentivized. That being said, we have tillage, we have cover crops very much at the forefront. We have these livestock things that are coming close, but over time in the next 10, 15 years, we're going to see this build out tremendously to a variety of different practices that are in many cases maybe even easier to do or easier to track than having cover crops or going no-till. The one that comes to mind first is nitrogen fertilizer use. Nitrogen fertilizer has a huge carbon footprint. because if the nitrogen doesn't end up in the plant and is released to the atmosphere, it's a very potent greenhouse gas. Obviously, no one wants to waste nitrogen fertilizer. There's a cost there, but we might see additional incentives, on a per ton basis, saying, if you can use this more efficiently, we'll pay you for that because that will help this climate situation. And that's the one example, maybe the next best example of what will be coming, but there's likely going to be dozens or more, hundreds of practices that might be eligible for some sort of incentive in this new carbon space. One of the things I'd like to talk about too, and maybe you've looked at this, the decision to go no-till or the decision to incorporate cover crops, they're really big decisions for a farmer to make. They're not a, should I change my rotation? Should I, use this prescription for, what my agronomist is saying to take care of my field this year? It's really a much longer term decision, and one that we don't necessarily have financial incentives for much of what's going to change. So if we think about what happens with no-till, it takes years to realize the benefits. You're most likely going to take a yield hit in early years. Over time, the benefits will exceed those costs, but can you actually stretch that far? Can you cash flow in that period? Is it something your lender agrees with? Also, do you have the right type of soil where no-till works? Is your agroclimatic conditions, suitable for no-till? And all of those things are really, really important. And my advice, and I'll touch on this again later, is you do this homework first. And the reason you do that is so then you actually know for your farm what the benefits and the costs are at your own speed and to your own satisfaction before you talk to the carbon folks. And the idea is when the carbon folks come, you can rush a little bit and not be as thorough in your decision making. One of the other things that makes no-till really difficult is it's really tough to measure the benefits. To forecast exactly what they're going to be and when. A lot of the benefits are non-financial, right? So if it's moisture management, either retaining moisture in the soil or managing a wet spring, that's real. That, I mean, there's truly a benefit to that, what we call an economic benefit. There just might not be a market for it. And so being able to identify and measure that can be really, really difficult. Does not mean it's not real. So one of the questions I get is, how do you actually calculate how much carbon's being captured? So there's been a ton of research done primarily by land grants. And actually South Dakota State is at the forefront of this, especially on the soil side, which is really neat. But anyways, a lot of research has been done that says this practice has caused this amount of soil carbon to increase. And then we have models, equations that will say, in this condition, we'd expect this. And that's really how they calculate the carbon. So they map the practice, say cover crops in your county, and they will say, well, we expect that to result in 300 pounds per acre of carbon being captured. And that's, that is based on scientific research by significant amounts of empirical evidence to kind of support that. And then from that per acre basis, we can multiply across the acres that might be signed up to get that number of metric tons of carbon captured. The mechanism of carbon and how it's managed and the integrity of the system depends on what's on an organization called the carbon registry. In the carbon offset market, they play a really, really important role. So essentially what they do, they're the arbiters, the determiners if a given practice, and the practice not just in terms of what you're going to do in your field, but also how that carbon offset company is going to oversee that practice, to document, maybe measure things later on. That program, that protocol is submitted to a registry. They verify and they say, yes, we think that works, that looks good. if you have a farmer sign up for this practice, we will certify that so many carbon credits per acre will be created. Very, very important, because then when you look at the Microsofts of the world, they don't want to go all the way to the farmer. They just want to buy carbon credits with some sort of value, some sort of credibility. And so that's what those registries provide. And again, within that application that a carbon company would submit, what is the practice? How are we going to monitor it? How are we going to measure any reductions if they go that way? All of that is part of a big application that registries oversee. And then those conditions, feed into that contract that a farmer gets. Getting more to the heart of things, how much should you be paid? First off, to look at those costs and those benefits, to know beforehand what the costs and benefits of these new practices are exclusive of a carbon contract. Then you also need to sit down and think about what the carbon is worth. So a lot of farmers view this, because that's the way it's presented, in I can get an extra $5 an acre if I go no-till. And that's right, but you have to realize the folks who are offering that $5 for no-till don't care about no-till. They want the carbon associated with it. And right now, in general, what we have is most farmers value their carbon at zero. We don't think about that value it has, even though it most certainly does. And that has to be part of the consideration. Because of the nature of the market, and the lack of transparency, you can talk about these things that make markets efficient. We don't know what the prices being traded are. I can certainly talk to the carbon companies themselves or to farmers and say, what did you sign that contract for? And I can get that price, but there's not a futures market or other market. There's not a local bid sheet from the elevator that says this is what's being offered for these practices, or so much per metric ton of CO2 today. And that causes some problems, because the question is, as a farmer, it's like, well, why should I take this offer? A company's offering me $5 an acre today. Should I hold out for 10 if that happens? Or should I be concerned that the price is going to go down to 3, or that the offer is going to be rescinded? And in cases like that, we have a concept in economics and business. It's called the best alternative to no agreement. And it basically provides a framework for making decisions like that. And the idea is, if you don't take that offer, say it's $5 per acre, how does that affect you, right? What do you lose by turning it down? Well, you're not going to have that income, but you're also still going to have the option to sell later. And so in many cases, it's like, if this is something you're already going to do, you're already going to go no-till, and this is extra money, why wouldn't you sell? If you're happy with your financial situation, you really don't need extra income, you think for one reason or another that the price of carbon might go up, you might want to wait. It's really a tough situation. In general, what I've heard and seen is that most farmers who enter into this are already into that activity, right? Maybe they've actually already gone no-till, or already just recently started using cover crops. They're still in that window where it's acceptable to the buyer, and they really want to capture the value from that before those changes fade away. And something I talked about just a little bit, or got close to, and this is a really important issue. I talked about how most farmers don't value their carbon, or they value it at zero. They hear offers for going no-till and say, well, yeah, for another $5, no-till makes sense, and price their carbon at zero. But what's important to note is that every business, including South Dakota farms and ranches, every single one has a carbon liability. And that is likely going to be realized someday. And when it is, I don't think anybody's really prepared. And for example, when Tyson comes to you as a cattle producer or they come to you as a corn producer, or they come to you via a third party, they now care about that carbon footprint. Well, if you've done things, sold carbon offsets, that might impact your ability to market to a Tyson. It might not. We don't know yet. We don't know exactly what they're looking for, but that management of your carbon on farm, beginning a few years ago, already passed, does make a difference. And we could certainly reach a point where that carbon liability could be a very, very negative thing for some farms. I will mention in general, I think that there's overwhelming opportunity that on the whole, this carbon space is definitely a net positive for agriculture. But things like this, could cause trouble. The homework I advise for everybody is, if you have time, and this is really not the time of the year to do the homework, to sit down and think about what the economics of no-till or cover crops might be. I would only do this, again, you could talk, if you talk to your agronomist or other consultant, say, what would no-till look like in my fields, field by field, would it even make sense? And then go and sketch out the benefits and the costs of that. And then by next year, it's kind of a seasonality to this, like there's many things in agriculture. By next fall, next winter, you can have that informed conversation with those carbon offset companies. All that being said, so up to now, I've talked about the voluntary market. So corporations are the ultimate buyers. We now have a very, very large player in the federal government. They've come into this space very, very quickly and aggressively. The first evidence of this was in 2021. The first Biden COVID stimulus package included a $5 cover crop payment. So basically, anybody who had grown cover crops was eligible for this payment, and that program was administered by NRCS. Again, and the motivation for this was, obviously there's a number of benefits for cover crops, but this is really this might be climate-ish related, so be ready. And I took that as a signal. More recently, there's been activity in what we're calling climate smart agriculture. Last February, the USDA announced, and again, it's a $2 billion partnership program to help develop these carbon markets. And most of that money is to be pushed out to farmers and ranchers. And then more recently in August, we had the Inflation Reduction Act. And that includes almost $20 billion for NRCS to incentivize climate smart practices via existing programs like EQIP. And if we think about how much money this is relative to other parts of this carbon economy or other parts of the USDA budget, this is substantial. In 2022, last year, carbon offsets in agriculture were far less than $1 billion. And this new act, within 4 years, we're going to go up to 20. So you can really say this is up to a 5-fold increase in activity on the federal side. And this is not a bad thing too, again, because these funds can be used, they can be stacked. Get $5, $10, $50 an acre, whatever it is for that practice, maybe get funding to help offset the cost of new equipment, make the change, generate the carbon offset, sell that to a buyer. And then also we're at this point where we now have the Farm Bill under discussion, under active discussion, exactly what's going to happen with that. We don't know, but climate is very much a part of the Farm Bill today. It's kind of amazing because the last Farm Bill in 2016 was not that long ago. Climate was really not included. You can think about biofuels being included. And now we know that it's going to play a major role and will continue to play a major role in agriculture going forward. One of the last things I like to present is a slide and a photo from Canada. And this is really to kind of let folks understand the nature of carbon, to think about carbon as a product that they produce that has both a cost to it and a potential for being a source of revenue. So this picture is a slide from a farmer in Saskatchewan, which is not that far away. And this is a picture they took of a bill that they received for drying grain. So if you can think about a farmer in Saskatchewan who has to dry grain, probably wasn't like terribly excited to write that check in the first place, was hoping that, you know, Mother Nature would be able to get things done. But they have this bill. And in addition to the cost of just having service and the cost of the gas itself, they now also pay a federal carbon tax on every unit of natural gas they buy. And to make it even better, they also pay a federal sales tax on the carbon tax. So this is essentially increases the cost of that producer's gas bill by about 20%. It's a substantial real cost that they face. And one of the reasons I bring this up is I want folks to recognize, and this is on the negative side, and I don't think a carbon tax at the national level is anywhere close to being in our future, if at all. But that farmer in Saskatchewan, I'm almost sure 10 years ago did not see this coming. But today they have a bill that they have to pay. And that's really kind of this nature of carbon, that there are all of these things going on that are very, very important. And it doesn't matter necessarily if you participate directly in a carbon offset program, it's there. It might be good, it might not, might be worthwhile for you, it might not. Even if you don't sell corn directly to Tyson or sell livestock directly to Tyson, as they create their system, it's going to impact all of agriculture. And it's something that we all need to be ready for. I think this is one of my last slides, but it's a question I get, and I really like it, is the why don't I just till up my fields? You know, and I give this talk in a county that's been long using no-till. You know, there is this unfairness because you've been doing forever. You cannot participate in carbon offset programs. The private buyers aren't going to pay for this. But the important thing to note again is that the federal government, via the Inflation Reduction Act, possibly via the Farm Bill, is going to provide a remedy. The other thing that's going to happen is, we're just talking about the carbon offset market. You could likely still receive payment or some sort of value in terms of an inset. So we'll likely reach a day where your local elevator, or if you, even better, if you could sell direct to a food ingredient company, where they would pay you a premium for these practices, even if you've been using them for a long period of time. So that's what I had prepared. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I think we officially take those offline, but I want to thank everybody for joining me here today. The other thing I'd mention too is, if you do have questions going forward, do feel free to reach out. I'm happy to provide some amount of assistance. And again, there's a multi-state project going on right now where extending this type of information to South Dakota is something we're happy to do.